I talked in my first video about 118 Banbury Road, where Paul Jacobstall and the camel lived. In the second video, 78 Banbury Road, where most of the Oxford English Dictionary was created. And for this video, I want to talk about Northmoor Road, which is midway between those two houses and one street over. And what's absolutely fascinating is that between 1934 and 1936, the physicist Erwin Schrödinger lived at 24 Northmoor. And if you can believe it, 2 doors away, J.R.R. Tolkien lived at number 20. I mean, sure, it's Oxford, so you have all these great minds living near each other as a regular occurrence, but still, Schrödinger and Tolkien were practically neighbors. And not only that, but they did some of their most creative work in those couple of years when they were 2 doors down from each other. Schrödinger was a well-known physicist in Germany in 1933, and while he was not Jewish, when the first round of firings of Jewish professors took place in Germany that year, he decided to leave when he saw what was going on. I mean, it's a similar story to Paul Jacobstall, who I talked about earlier. So when Schrödinger came to Oxford, within a few weeks or few months of coming here, he won the Nobel Prize. And, I'm not sure that Schrödinger was a great hero of courage, in particular standing up to the Nazis, though, because a few years later he tried to negotiate with them to move back to Austria. But nonetheless, he ended up here in Oxford. He was well known, quite famous at the moment he was here. And for the 3 years he was here, he lived on Northmoor Road, which is a quiet street with professorial houses. In 1935, while living at number 24 Northmoor, he published what would become maybe his most famous paper, called The Present Situation in Quantum Mechanics, where he proposed a thought experiment. A cat is placed in a box with radioactive materials, a Geiger counter, and a sealed vial of poison. Well, I read a book by Paul Halpern about Schrödinger and his time in this house and the rest of his stories. It's called Einstein's Dice and Schrödinger's Cat, and I'm drawing a lot from it for this video. And according to Paul, the experiment that Schrödinger was proposing is that the cat is left in the box for a specific amount of time, which would give the radioactive material a 50-50 chance of emitting a radioactive particle. The Geiger counter sitting right next to it was set such that if it sensed a single particle, it would smash the vial of poison, releasing it and therefore killing the cat. And the issue that Schrödinger was raising in his paper was that until the box was opened and measured, quantum theory sort of measures this radioactive particle as existing in a 50-50 state, neither existing nor not, which was fine for quantum physicists, but of course doesn't make any sense when you extrapolate that then to say that the cat itself would be in a 50-50 half alive, half dead state until the box was opened. So Schrödinger writes this paper. It languishes for about 30 years until it was picked up in the 1960s, and at that time the term Schrödinger's cat has since become part of the popular culture. Schrödinger was inspired by Einstein. I saw Einstein give a talk when he was in his mid-20s. Schrödinger served in the First World War. And then he met a woman named Annie and got married in 1920. And then in 1933, he agreed to come to Magdalen College at Oxford on an interesting condition that he bring an assistant with him, a guy named Arthur March. And it wasn't so much that Schrödinger needed an assistant, but rather that Schrödinger fancied Arthur's wife, Hilda. So around this time, Hilda became pregnant with Schrödinger's child. Her name was Ruth, who was born in Oxford. And these two couples decided to work this out instead of getting divorced. But all of this to say that Schrödinger, upon arrival in Oxford, was, on the one hand, deeply celebrated for this brand new Nobel Prize win, but also alienated for his very unconventional marriage that was out of step with the Oxford conservative institution with its deep religious roots, certainly at that point in time. I mean, I like to imagine that Tolkien and Schrödinger met over the garden gate at Northmoor Road at some point and had a conversation, but um, all of this background makes it sort of unlikely that Tolkien would have wanted much to do with him. Tolkien certainly would have been aware of him for the Nobel Prize and other reasons. Schrödinger may not have even known Tolkien's name, though. Tolkien was in the middle of writing The Hobbit at this point, and he was a couple of years away from publishing it. It just wasn't, he just wasn't well known outside of Oxford at that time. But in 1935, Arthur, Hilda, and Ruth moved back to Austria, leaving Schrödinger with a reputation that would make it impossible for him to extend his position at Oxford. So he then went to Vienna and then to Dublin and back to Vienna later in life. He had a lifelong smoking habit, which left him with tuberculosis, and he died at the age of 73. Tolkien, in contrast, lived out all of his years in Oxford. He remained a committed Christian, no scandals, no illegitimate children. He was 45 when The Hobbit was published. He was the chair of Anglo-Saxon and expert in Old and Middle English. They were, they were just so different that they unlikely were to have been friends. But in the long arc of history, they did have some similarities. Tolkien took the arcane language of medieval England and Wales, and through stories made that language approachable and even ubiquitous. And Schrödinger really did the same thing. He sort of took the arcane language of quantum physics and through a cat and a story made it also feel very approachable. So you might say that their similarities outweighed their differences in some ways. Tolkien being an expert of the language of our past, and Schrödinger a real expert in the language of our future. To talk about Tolkien at number 20 Northmoor Road, in the summer of 1931 or 1932, I don't believe the exact date is recorded, he was there grading student papers. And in a famous story, he turned to a page that a student had left blank, and Tolkien filled it with his own words. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. And so it was from those beginnings, those words written on that blank sheet of paper, that he went on to complete the entire story. If he'd written in the hole in the ground there lived a rabbit, perhaps nothing would have come from it. But I think the term Hobbit might have been something he just invented in that moment and then inspired the story. Maybe it was a mixture of the words hobgoblin and rabbit. Who knows? There is a post office box at the end of Northmoor Road, or pillar box as they're called. Did Tolkien mail drafts from The Hobbit to his editor through this pillar box? Did Schrödinger post his article about the cat through this pillar box? Maybe. This particular one is from about 1905. It's from the short reign of King Edward VII, and you can tell that because there's a small VII in the curl of the letter E. Well, thanks to Tom Shippey and his book J.R.R. Tolkien, Author of the Century, as well as Paul Halpern in his book. And yes, Tolkien's name is pronounced that way, not as many say Tolkien. Well, you can hear more about the writing of the Oxford English Dictionary that happened a few doors away in my last video, and I will talk more about Tolkien in my next one. See you then.